Once again, you're working late." The fake concern in Greg's voice was thick, as if he genuinely cared, but I knew better. His shout came from the kitchen, an attempt to stir up some reaction. I glanced up from my laptop, carefully masking the irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. "This week's full of big deadlines," I replied, my tone casual, almost detached, as if his words didn't affect me. He didn't miss a beat, pouring himself a glass of wine with a grin that made my skin crawl. "Please, Holly, you must relax. Life is more than just work, you know." If only he truly understood. I'm Holly, and for the last 6 months I've been leading 2 completely different lives. Not the glamorous, high society kind that you might be imagining, but a secret existence. One where everything is at stake. The mask I wear at home is nothing compared to the person I've become when I step outside this house. What is it that's so important in my other life? Stick around, because the truth is more complicated than anyone could imagine. No, my double life consisted of putting up a front while surreptitiously assembling proof of my husband's treachery. Little things were the first. Charges on our credit card for fancy restaurants I hadn't been to, incoherent late-night meetings, and a subtle smell of strange perfume on his clothing. I initially persuaded myself I was dreaming, but one day I came across a receipt for a down payment on a car while sorting through the mail. A high-end vehicle. I didn't have that. I gently questioned him about the unusual costs at first. Ever the slick talker, Greg shrugged it away. "Work perks," he had smiled. "My clientele want to celebrate, you know." I wanted to trust him, but I could tell the truth was far less innocent by the way he avoided my eyes. I therefore began to listen. Finding the whole picture didn't take long. Greg wasn't simply being unfaithful. He was supporting Melanie, his alleged client, with our joint savings. Expensive meals, shopping excursions, and the highlight of the show, the car he intended to give her as a present for their anniversary. It was all breathtakingly audacious. While he depleted our finances to win over a woman who most likely couldn't spell commitment if her life depended on it, I was working late into the night to ensure our future. But I said nothing, refusing to confront him. I opened my laptop and started making plans that evening. As Greg sat down on the couch, I looked up repossession businesses, legal remedies, and fraud reporting procedures. Every keystroke was driven by a resolve I hadn't experienced in a long time. Greg didn't understand he'd underestimated me, but he felt he was smart. I was prepared to clean the house if he wanted to play dirty. I did my part flawlessly over the next 3 weeks. I asked Greg about his work travels, laughed at his jokes, and even feigned not to notice when he would return home smelling like an expensive fragrance that I hadn't purchased for him. However, I was constructing my case behind the scenes. Reporting fraud was the first step. I took advantage of the fact that the dealership documents solely bore Greg's name. Even though the automobile was bought with our joint finances, I pretended that I needed more details regarding the transaction when I called the dealership. I had everything I needed by the time I hung up: dates, totals, and evidence that the purchase was made without my permission. Yet I called the bank to follow up on that. I informed the fraud department that I think my account has been compromised. A sizable transaction that I did not authorize has occurred. They initiated an investigation after flagging the account. I tightened the noose on Greg's plan at each step. I watched him in the meantime. I made mental notes every time he smirked over his phone or muttered into it like a teenage kid, trying to make a call. I even got a look of one of Melanie's texts. "I am eagerly awaiting the surprise you promised." The surprise? Definitely the automobile. My stomach turned at the prospect, yet it strengthened my determination. Greg believed he was a superb manipulator, but he had overlooked a very important detail. I was able to wait. The plans for the anniversary came together almost too well. Greg recommended that Melanie and he have a classy meal at one of his favorite places. He had remarked, "I want to treat you right," with a smile that used to make me swoon but now only made me shiver. "Sounds great," I said, putting on a charming smile to cover my disdain. I was aware that he was using the dinner as a pretext to later give Melanie the automobile, but I wasn't going to allow him to get away with it. Greg left for another client meeting that evening, so I worked with a fraud investigator to complete the specifics. The reposition team was scheduled after the acquisition of the car was flagged. Greg thought he was winning, but everything was about to happen. I experienced an odd sense of serenity when I shut down my laptop. I had been silently bearing the consequences of his betrayal for weeks, feigning ignorance of the lies that were being told all around me. The balance of power had changed, though. Greg was unaware that his entire world was about to fall apart. Greg was at his best on the evening of our anniversary supper. He carried a bottle of champagne and a bouquet of roses as he walked into the house in a dapper suit. He smiled and leaned in to give me a cheek kiss, saying, "Happy anniversary, babe." With a calm voice and a prepared smile, I said, "Happy anniversary." If he was aware of my rigidity, he didn't express it. He was gloating too much. Greg did not cut any corners at the restaurant. He arranged for a pianist to perform our song and ordered the most exquisite food and wine. If I didn't know the truth, it would have been romantic. Greg's phone buzzed while he was sipping his wine. When he read the letter, his face brightened, but he immediately attempted to hide it. "Is everything all right?" I pretended to be interested as I asked. Putting the phone back in his pocket, he added, "Just a work thing. There's nothing to be concerned about." I suppressed a smile as I nodded. I was well aware of the message's content. Melanie waited for her to be surprised. Greg proposed that we go for a walk after supper. "This night is so lovely," he remarked, putting his arm around my shoulders. I followed his instructions and followed him back to the car. Despite his gentlemanly demeanor, I could see the eagerness in his eyes as he opened the passenger door for me. He was keeping track of the minutes till he could leave me and give Melanie his extravagant gesture. Upon returning home, I observed Greg constantly checking his watch, his agitation hardly disguised. Finally, in a casual tone, he added, "I've got to run out for a bit. Workplace crisis." "During our anniversary?" With an innocent twist of my head, I asked. He told me that it wouldn't take long. "It's just something I have to deal with." I gave a charming smile. "Don't let me keep you, of course." I leaned back on the couch with my heart racing as he picked up the keys and left. I could already picture the scene playing out. Greg arrived at Melanie's house, gave her the keys, and reveled in her admiration. Prior to the arrival of the repossession crew, there was complete repossession. Everything proceeded according to plan. With my hands shaking, I gazed at the screen as a wave of relief and satisfaction passed over me. Greg was unaware that his flawless little act had suddenly fallen apart, and I wasn't left to pick up the pieces this time. Later that evening, Greg came back with a flushed face and a marked lack of his typical swagger. His keys clinked loudly as he threw them on the counter and slammed the front door harder than he should have. "A difficult evening?" I looked up from the book I was feigning to read and inquired. His words were controlled, but he gave me a look. "Just some unforeseen complications," he muttered, tugging at his tie knot. "Can I be of any assistance?" My voice was brimming with pretended worry as I asked. "No," he said sharply, before swiftly lowering his voice. "It's okay, really. You've nothing to be concerned about." I suppressed a grin and went back to reading, allowing the stillness to grow between us. It was nearly too satisfying to see Greg writhe, but I wasn't finished yet. Detective Ruiz texted me again as he vanished into the bedroom, muttering something about having to figure things out. They claimed that the car was accidentally removed. "I'll keep you informed." Imagining Greg's embarrassment as he attempted to justify the repossession without disclosing the deception, I laughed quietly. Greg was pacing the kitchen when I woke up the following morning. His voice was low and strained when he spoke on the phone. He was saying, "I don't care what it takes. Simply fix it." When he saw me standing in the doorway, he stopped suddenly. "She's angry, and I can't." I poured myself a cup of coffee and said, "Good morning." He made an effort to smile. "Good morning. Just taking care of some business." I took a drink of coffee and muttered, "Sounds stressful. Is there anything I should be aware of?" "No," he answered in a harsh tone. "There is nothing to be concerned about." For the remainder of the day, Greg remained unusually silent. He muttered under his breath and even slammed the lid shut in disgust as he worked on his laptop for hours. Although there was little he could do, I could see he was attempting to save the day. The dealership wasn't going to return the car without answers because the fraud report had sparked a thorough inquiry. Greg's patience was wearing thin by the evening. "Have you ever had the impression that the universe is working against you?" His tone was angry as he asked abruptly. "Sometimes," I said, maintaining a bland expression. "But don't you think the cosmos has a way of bringing everything into balance?" His gaze lingered a bit too long, as though he assumed I knew more than I revealed, but he didn't answer. Greg's deteriorating temper became more apparent every day. He was irritable, preoccupied, and always on the phone, arguing with the person on the other end. He wasn't pressed by me. Rather, I sat and observed, quietly relishing the disintegration of his meticulously crafted facade. I heard a very angry call one evening. Greg's voice was quiet but angry as he paced the living room. He snarled, "I promised to fix it. It's not my fault. Just give me a little more time. These things do occur." I knew to whom he was speaking. "Melanie." I pretended to browse through my phone while leaning against the kitchen counter, but my entire being was riveted to what he was saying. Greg murmured, "She's overreacting," obviously attempting to reassure the person on the other end. "This doesn't have to be a huge deal. I'll take care of it." Greg mumbled a series of insults as he threw his phone onto the couch as the call ended suddenly. "Is everything all right?" I inquired, pretending to be innocent as I entered the living room. Startled, he looked up and gritted his teeth. "Yes, only work matters." I sat down opposite him and said, "It must be tough. You've been under a lot of stress recently. Are you certain I can't be of any assistance?" He shook his head, but his jaw tightened. "No, I'm in control of it. Detective Ruiz gave me another update that evening. The inquiry is proceeding. The fraud report has been confirmed by the dealership. The activities of your husband are being examined." With a mixture of relief and excitement, I gazed at the message. Greg was unaware that the net was drawing near. Greg's mood reached a new low the next morning. He hardly touched his coffee as he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. His voice was colored with bitterness as he said, "I don't know what's wrong with people these days. Everyone has their own interests in mind." I nearly choked on my coffee, but I was able to contain my laughter. "Really? What took place?" He dismissively waved his hand. "Only a few setbacks. You have nothing to be concerned about." "Naturally," I replied nicely, smirking behind my mug's rim. By week's end, Greg was clearly losing his mind. He had lost his self-assured manner and had become a man struggling to stay afloat. That night, I leaned against the doorway while he sat in the living room, typing frantically on his laptop. I responded nonchalantly, "You know, Greg, sometimes people get exactly what they deserve." His fingers briefly hovered over the keyboard as he froze, then turned to face me. "What is the intended meaning of that?" I shrugged, my face composed. "Just something to consider." One Saturday night was the tipping point. Greg had been irritable and angry with everyone and everything all day. His meticulously kept mask completely fell off by the time he received a call from Melanie. His phone buzzed as I was in the kitchen. He took a quick look at the screen, muttered a curse, and went outside to answer the phone. I followed silently out of curiosity, keeping out of sight by the open window. "You don't understand," Greg growled in a panicked tone. "I'm not to blame, although I didn't. The dealership is accusing me of fraud." He hesitated, obviously cut off by an angry outburst from the other person. His voice cracked as he said, "I promised to fix it." "Do you believe that I enjoy this more than you do? Melanie, just give me a little more time." Even though her voice was muffled, it was clear that she was angry. Greg rushed back inside once he hung up, slamming the door so forcefully that it rattled the windows. "Is everything all right?" As he rushed by, I looked up from my laptop and questioned naively. "All right," he said, vanishing into the bedroom. I heard the distinct sound of drawers being jerked open and slammed shut a few moments later. He was furiously searching through his closet, flinging clothes and shoes onto the bed, when I peeked into the room out of curiosity. "What are you doing?" I leaned against the doorframe and inquired. "Quickly," he said. "Packing." "Packing?" I arched an eyebrow. "Are you heading somewhere?" His voice was tense as he urged, "Don't start, Holly." "Right now, I don't have time for this." As I watched him load various objects into a duffel bag, I crossed my arms. "Greg, what's going on? You had been behaving oddly for the entire week." He turned around after he froze for a second with his back to me. "It's nothing," he said in a sharper than normal tone. I just have an urgent job matter to attend to. I stared at him, allowing the awkward pause to linger. I grinned at last. If you say so. I got a text from Detective Ruiz as Greg was leaving with his hurriedly packed bag. The probe is proceeding quickly. More advancements are on the horizon. A strange mixture of suspense and joy filled me as I sat on the couch and stared at the door Greg had just entered. He believed that he was rushing to make things better, but in reality, nothing needed to be fixed. It would be too late by the time he realized it. I let myself unwind for the first time in weeks. The parts were coming together, and the strategy was moving forward. Now I just needed to wait. If I had learned anything over the years, it was how to wait. When I got up on Monday, I saw a ton of missed calls and anxious voicemails from Greg. It's urgent, Holly. Give me a call back. You're where? I have to speak with you right now. They are claiming fraud, which is untrue. I need your assistance to repair this. Without hesitation, I erased them all, relishing the silent victory of realizing that the roles had finally been reversed. I texted Detective Ruiz for an update over coffee. He responded quickly. This morning, Greg attempted to get in touch with the dealership. He's in a panic, but there is little he can do to reverse the pace of the fraud probe. I grinned to myself, picturing Greg's expression as he saw there was no escape. The doorbell rang about noon. Greg was standing on the doorstep, looking desperate and unkempt when I opened it. His tie was loose, his shirt was wrinkled, and he lacked his customary haughtiness. "We need to talk," he remarked in an imploring tone. I leaned against the doorframe with my arms crossed. "Greg, what are you talking about? The vehicle that you purchased for your mistress, or the accusations of fraud you are dealing with?" Panic flashed across his face as his eyes widened. "I can explain, Holly." "No need," I interrupted him. "I am fully informed. The automobile, the fancy dinners, the fictitious business trips, I've known for months. Even though you didn't think I would notice," he stammered as he attempted to put together a case, but I didn't give him the opportunity. "You funded your falsehoods with our money?" My voice was steady as I spoke. "You're paying the price for betraying me." With his hands outstretched in surrender, he took a step closer. "I made a mistake, but we can correct it. I'll reimburse you. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." I arched an eyebrow. "Will you reimburse me? With what? Your hollow assurances? Or Melanie's letters of love?" I knew I had touched a nerve when he winced at the mention of her name. I took a step back and pointed to the pile of papers on the entry table before he could reply. I answered, "You can begin by signing these." Greg paused, examining the papers. "What is this?" I said. "Divorce papers. You will soon lose access to everything else, just as you have already lost the car. Think of this as your last opportunity to go with what little dignity you still possess." His jaw tensed as he gazed at me. I thought he may dispute for a second, but then his shoulders slumped in surrender. Weakly, he murmured, "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I firmly responded, "because I know how to finish what I start. Unlike you." Greg walked out without saying anything more, and I was so relieved when I shut the door after him. I felt free for the first time in years, after the man who had stolen so much from me was finally gone. After Greg went, the home was strangely quiet, but not the eerie calm I had become accustomed to during our marriage. This was the sort that meant freedom, the kind that was calm. Sitting at the kitchen table, I gazed at the divorce papers that had been signed. Greg had grudgingly left, his entreaties still ringing in my ears, but I was no longer burdened by the guilt of his treachery. I felt in control for the first time in months. I began to stitch my life back together over the course of the next few days. Meeting with my attorney to complete the divorce was the first step. Ever efficient, Clara was ecstatic at how well things were going. Flipping through her notes, Clara stated, "He doesn't have much leverage with the fraud investigation and the financial evidence we've got. The house, your possessions, and whatever money left over that he hasn't wasted will all be yours." "What about the case of fraud?" With a steady yet inquisitive tone, I asked. "That's going forward too," Clara said. "Detective Ruiz has made certain that everything is in order. Greg is going to be charged shortly, and based on the evidence, he probably won't get out of jail." I nodded, feeling a sort of closure that I hadn't known I needed because of the news. I concentrated on taking back the area Greg had attempted to encroach on as the court cases proceeded. I changed the old drapes to ones I had chosen, moved the furniture around, and even painted the living room a gentle shade of blue, my favorite color, not his. One afternoon, Amanda arrived with a bottle of wine and paint rollers to assist. As we worked, she remarked, "This place already feels different. The energy he attempted to drain from it seems to have been restored by you. That's the objective," I smiled in response. Instead of serving as a reminder of him, I want this house to feel like mine. In addition, I began getting back in touch with acquaintances I had lost throughout my marriage. Greg had always demanded to be in charge of our social life, deciding who we could hang out with and when. I could now choose what I wanted. Amanda and a few close friends joined me for a little dinner party one evening. I became aware of how much I had missed being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, rather than the version of me Greg had attempted to mold, while we laughed and told tales over a supper I had prepared myself. Greg's fraud probe was still moving along. Every few days, Detective Ruiz called to give me updates. His voice was always professional, but also laced with joy. During one call, he stated that the dealership was totally cooperating. Greg's efforts to hide his activities only made matters worse. "It will not be long until we complete this." Feeling both relieved and validated, I thanked him. Greg had tried to control me for years, but he had only succeeded in outwitting himself. I stood in the center of my newly painted living room, taking in everything, while I hung up the phone. Even though the house was silent, it didn't feel deserted. It was familiar. I had a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years in the weeks following Greg's departure. Once tense and full of deceit, the house now felt like a haven. I opened my notebook and began writing down future ideas one morning while enjoying coffee on the back patio. I had spent so much of my life trying to satisfy Greg, appeasing his whims and correcting his errors. I was able to give myself my full attention for the first time. I typed, "Things I've always wanted to do" at the top of the page. The list grew rapidly. Redesign the home's interior, go to Greece, launch my own company, spend more time with your loved ones. Every object felt like a step toward recovering my identity, which had been too long eclipsed by Greg's self-centeredness. I began by taking on the first task on the list. I changed the house to fit my personal tastes with Amanda's assistance. Cozy, welcoming, and unreservedly mine. We replaced Greg's insisted up-on furniture, painted the walls bright colors, and even converted his former home office into an art studio. As we hung a large artwork on the wall of the living room, Amanda remarked, "This feels like you. The house seems to finally fit the individual who lives there." I grinned, a wave of pride washing over me. Although it's still a work in progress is being made. I had to rebuild my career next. Greg had dissuaded me from pursuing my career goals during our marriage, arguing that his aspirations took precedence. I was determined now to make up for the time I had missed. I got in touch with former mentors and coworkers to let them know about my predicament and my desire to return to the industry. Their encouragement was tremendous, and I had a number of exciting prospects set up in a matter of weeks. An old boss called me one evening and offered me a consultancy job on a subject I was really interested in. "It would be wonderful to have you back," she said. I said, "Thank you," feeling a sense of approval I hadn't known I needed. "I'm prepared." I started to see minor but important changes in myself as I got used to my new schedule. I was more self-assured, more decisive, and more risk-taken. Greg's installation of fear and self-doubt was beginning to give way to a quiet power I was unaware I had. Sitting on the couch with a glass of wine one evening, I grinned as I glanced around the house. Now this was my life, messy, flawed, and wholly mine. Detective Ruiz called me a couple weeks later. He declared that the fraud inquiry was completely over. Greg has been officially charged, and in a few months the case will go to trial. Not because I felt sorry for Greg, but because it represented the ultimate disintegration of the life we had once led together. The news impacted me more than I had anticipated. I meant it when I told Ruiz, "Thank you for everything." The loss of anticipation lingered in the back of his mind, but on this particular morning, I doubted I would have had the strength to finish this without his leadership. He said it simply, Justice takes time, but it's worth it. I poured a glass of wine for myself that night and sat on the back deck to gaze at the sky. I was finally able to get the closure I had been seeking, but it came with an odd variety of feelings. I felt relieved, satisfied, and a little sad for the life I had imagined. The following day, Amanda arrived, bringing her typical enthusiasm to the house. She handed me a bag of takeout and added, "You look different," as if a burden had been removed. "Perhaps it has," I said, grinning slightly. "The divorce is nearly complete and Greg's charges are proceeding. I feel as though I can breathe at last." Amanda smiled. "You almost seem to glow. What comes next?" I pointed to the coffee table's notebook. "I've been planning, traveling, working, and possibly starting my own company. I'm at last discovering what I want rather than what other people think I should do." Amanda raised her glass in a toast and teased that it was about time. "Cheers to the upcoming chapter." I began crossing additional things off my list in the weeks that followed. I finally got the opportunity to travel alone to Greece, something I had always wanted to do. I got a sense of adventure I hadn't experienced in years as I considered touring historic sites and strolling along sunny beaches. At the same time, I threw myself into my consulting work with gusto. Each step I took felt like a declaration, one that moved me farther from my past. The mistakes I had made and the betrayal I had endured no longer had the power to define who I was. It was in my newly remodeled living room on a quiet afternoon when my gaze fell on the framed photo sitting on the fireplace mantel. It was an old picture of Amanda and me, captured long before Greg had ever entered my life. As I looked at it now, something about the image struck me, something I had overlooked before. The woman in that photo, strong and independent, was still me. Despite everything Greg had thrown my way, despite his relentless attempts to break me, he had never managed to take that away from me. And now I was ready to move forward, leaving the past behind, no more looking back. Curious about how this journey unfolds and the unexpected twists that await? Make sure to subscribe to SoraBook for more captivating stories. In the next videos, you won't want to miss what comes next.